Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, episode 52, and 52 is a special number for me. That was my old high school football number. Means nothing to you guys, but hey, for me, it kind of has a little sentimental value there. And today, we bring on Dr. David Grantham from the National Center of Policy Analysis. And if you remember, Jackie Pick from our Trump 100-Day Roundtable, and when I went on her show, she's from the same organization. And so thanks to Luke Twombly for setting all this up. He's been a great help, and I've enjoyed working with him to get these interviews lined up. And this is a very important discussion, especially for our listeners in Texas, because today's show is really about the cyber threats that face the Texas grid. And so if you're a listener not in Texas, you may say, well, this isn't really important for me. But no, I would say that it is, because Dr. Grantham talks about how to think about cyber terrorism. Now, Texas is uniquely vulnerable, he says, and you can listen to that and decide for yourself. But these principles of what he's concerned about could apply to South Africa. They could apply to China. We have listeners all over the world, and they could apply to you. So be sure to check it out, and we will link to his two papers that we discussed in the show notes, which you can find at globalenergymedia.com, as always. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. David Grantham. Dr. Grantham, thank you for coming on the show today. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Okay, so let's set the stage here. You are an expert in national security matters and affairs. In particular, today we're talking about cyber threats that face the energy industry, especially the electric grid. Kind of walk us through your background and kind of what led you to some of the conclusions that we're going to get into today.
Yeah, well, I began my career with the Air Force, and I worked in counterintelligence and counterterrorism. And my last station, I worked on research and technology protection, and that had to do with Air Force technology and aircraft and all the widgets and digits that the Air Force produced. And from that, I really got into infrastructure. And because there was so much that went into the technical side, there was so much that went into it that when I joined the NCPA, I began doing work in support of infrastructure protection, whether it be water and food, or just a personal interest, but also professional. And then I stumbled on, or at least did some research on Texas and how Texas has its own electric grid. And that really became a passion or a focus of mine over time. And the interest that we have in protecting the grid and the interest our adversaries have in the grid has prompted me to do more and more research on its viability, its protections. And now in the age of cybersecurity, I'm realizing that there is a major gap between our infrastructure, technology, and the capabilities of our adversaries.
Okay, so we have a global audience. So when you said that Texas is kind of unique, let's break that down. What does that mean when you say that? So
Texas, there are three electric grids, if you will. They're all interconnected, but they're run separately. You have the Western, the Eastern, and the Texas grid. Now, the grid doesn't necessarily follow the borders of Texas like it would on a map, but it covers a majority of the state. And it's important because Texas governs itself. And so when people, I'm not originally from the state, but there is actually some truth to Texas is kind of its own country. And with the electric grid, it is. It really can run itself. It can protect itself. And so it's important for Texas, and it's unique for Texas to have its own grid.
Okay, and we're going to link to both of these articles that we're referencing in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com. So let's get into it. You open it up, it says title, The Texas Grid and U.S. National Security. And right there, if your eyes kind of hit the middle of the screen, it says, the threat cannot be overstated. What is the threat, and why can it not be overstated?
The threat to the grid in the last 10 years has jumped for a number of reasons. I should say the likelihood has increased. That's probably a better way of saying it. And for a number of reasons. One is the cyber threat. Cyber changes on a daily basis. The capabilities of our adversaries mature on a weekly, monthly basis. And the fact that the grid is an old infrastructure overlaid with new technology makes it a problem, because you now have old infrastructure that's attached to 21st century technology. The two are not intended to commingle. So what you have is an issue of interdependence among infrastructure and technology that aren't really that compatible. So there's a major threat there. Secondarily, you have the issues of kinetic warfare not being the primary driver of wars these days. So what I mean by that is you're not going to see bunker to bunkers type warfare that you would have seen in World War I, World War II. And that seems obvious these days, but once you start breaking it down, you understand it to be adversaries are looking for soft spots. They're looking for opportunities to incapacitate the enemy without confronting the enemy militarily. The grid is one of the primary targets of that new type of warfare. Now, the utilities have put in place protections to ensure against this. Now, there are experts that would argue the protections don't go far enough, but that's kind of a different debate. The issue is undeniable that the grid is now becoming a primary target of the adversaries, and simply because you can take out your enemy or the adversary, you can take out the United States without having to confront them militarily, which you will most likely lose.
Okay, and so for the audience's benefit, we're recording this on May 22nd, and within, 14 days ago, there was a large ransomware attack, I believe, was what it was called. That's kind of a global scale, maybe, that was in the news, and it kind of died away pretty quickly. So would people look at that and say, well, okay, yeah, there was a large-scale attack, but, okay, here's a case where people were kind of wigging out, and all of a sudden, some guy walks into his room and fixes it, and it's kind of overblown. So what would you say to people like that? They go, well, yeah, we hear your hype, but here was an attack that looked sophisticated, and it was ended pretty quickly.
Well, I think the issue with cyber, it's not so much and I hear people that have this line of logic, and it's not wrong, but I think we're looking at it inappropriately. So instead of looking at the timeline of the attack, you need to look at the consequences. Hospitals were frankly unable to run because of this ransomware. The reason it wasn't as widespread is because the ransomware took advantage of people using old software. Now, in the United States, most of the time, we're not using bootleg software. We're not using old software. We generally update our systems pretty regularly. But in a lot of places overseas, especially in Eastern Europe, Russia, and some other places, Asia, where the ransomware hit, the hit was significant, was because they're running on old software. So you really don't want to compare apples, and you're comparing apples and oranges here if you say the consequences weren't that bad. Well, it's because the ransomware was kind of a second string malware, if you think of it like that in sports terminology. It was taking advantage of something that is generally fixed in the Western world, if you will, in most places. If you want a better comparison and consequences, look at Stuxnet. That was the virus that took out the nuclear centrifuges in Iran back in 2010, I believe it was. It physically destroyed centrifuges. So that means cyber has graduated from something of just data manipulation to the capabilities to damage equipment. Now, that was a state-sponsored and state-crafted malware, but it nevertheless proves that malware can have the consequences of physically damaging something. That's where my concern is with the grid.
But let's kind of set the parameters here. These attacks that you're talking about. So when I hear that, I'm thinking that you're thinking that this is country on country, not necessarily a band of hackers that are going to get together and do this kind of attack. Is that a good way of thinking about it? Or could a band of hackers kind of group together and launch this kind of attack?
I think, it's hard to say because cyber is the proliferation of this stuff. It can get out. So when we go back to Stuxnet, the reason that virus was discovered, it was intended to be launched. By all accounts, it was crafted by Israel and the United States, but it wasn't intended to be discovered. It was only discovered because an Iranian scientist used an infected computer and attached to an outside line. So it proliferated itself on the rest of the internet, so people were able to look at it. That wasn't supposed to happen. So if that happens, then yes, a group of hackers could theoretically sit down, reverse engineer this malware, and then resend it. It's highly unlikely in many cases because you do need a lot of money and a lot of expertise to craft something. So I would say, yes, it's possible that a group of hackers could put together something, but it's probably more probable that you will see state-to-state activity, or you will see a rogue expert using the state apparatus and using the state technology to attack another state.
Okay, what makes Texas unique? What are some of the targets that a sovereign nation might look at and say, well, if we're going to attack the U.S., we're going to specialize on Texas because they have what?
Well, there's several things. That's a great question. And this is one, again, I'm not from Texas, so I'm not trying to beat my chest on why the state is so important. Just looking at the facts. So it's one of the largest economies in the country. It has the second largest amount of cyber jobs in the country now. I mean, the corridor from Austin to the Dallas-Fort Worth area down to Houston and back over to Austin, it's becoming its own Silicon Valley, if you will. But most importantly, I think what I find to be the most likely reason that Texas will become a target is its military infrastructure. 11% of the entire military station in the United States is in Texas. Some of the most important assets the military has, planes, training, technology, are in Texas. There are more bases in Texas outside of California and the DC area. There are more bases in Texas than anywhere else in the country. And that goes with defense contractors. Some of the most important defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, L3, they have their biggest operations here in Texas. So as an adversary, I look at that and say, well, if I can take out Texas, I can at least incapacitate a major portion of the U.S. military, and therefore they're less likely to respond quickly. So if you can take out Texas, you're really hampering a military defense posture for the United States and a military response capability for the United States.
Okay, and so when I hear about Texas, the threats to Texas and those targets, one of the things I think about is when you watch the national news, at least, it seems that the threats to Texas are people crossing the border, maybe sneaking a dirty bomb or some kind of maybe EMP or I don't know, but threats across the border. How does those kind of threats compare with what you're talking about?
Well, I think that there's different capabilities in those threats. So obviously a state-backed cyber attack or a state-backed EMP, the electromagnetic pulse, which you just mentioned, those are generally going to come from, if they're high profile, they would come from like a nuclear detonation in the atmosphere. That creates an EMP. There's also briefcase EMPs, which send out a much smaller scale EMP, electromagnetic pulse, that might disrupt local communications. The threat when we talk about the border is more about terrorism, in my estimation, than anything else. Terrorist organizations have taken advantage of those smuggling routes, human smuggling routes, from everyone from Brazil through Central America and up through Mexico. An interesting fact that your listeners want to know that the Arizona Attorney General's office did some research and through their investigations found that the most wire transfers that came out of the United States, they went to a town on the southern border of Mexico. The second most went to a town in Nogales on the northern border of Mexico. So strangely enough, the only two places, or the major recipients were in those two locations, which tell you that that's a curious phenomenon, if you ask me. So I really believe that terrorism is an issue when we talk about the border and infiltration there.
Okay, so just so I'm following along, let me ask this. If I'm understanding what you're saying is that these cyber threats that you're concerned about, they would cause more catastrophic damage, whereas a terrorist attack could cause severe damage, but not on the scale that what you're afraid of. Am I hearing you correctly there?
Yeah, and I think that's the history of terrorism. It's intended to terrorize. It's not intended to debilitate.
Right.
Whereas a state-sponsored attack is intended to literally take out the enemy or incapacitate them. Where terrorism is while it can come in all shapes and sizes, it won't really stop the United States from functioning per se.
Right. Okay, and I want to ask you about the potential state-sponsored threats, but before I do, you mentioned something a minute ago I want to follow back up on, is you said that, okay, well, here are the targets that are in Texas, and you kind of listed them off, defense contractors, military bases, etc. Someone might hear that and go, well, if all those big, those big important things are here, shouldn't we have better security here already? And if we don't, then why don't we?
Oh, that's a great question. That's the primary motivation behind me writing some of these papers, is to educate local officials on how important their state is. One thing I've noticed just in my, just as a illustration for your listeners, is that local officials are often locally focused. What they fail to take into account sometimes is how important they are to the geopolitics of the country and the world. Texas is such a great environment for business, such a great environment for consumers, such a great environment for international business, that the state itself is quickly becoming a hub for a lot of what goes on in the world, in the Western Hemisphere, in the country. And so people in D.C. understand this because they often have to look at where these interests, where U.S. interests lie, where they're most important in the world's eyes. And so I write this stuff to stress to local officials. You need to be educated on how important your state is. And I think from there is when they begin to appreciate greater security on a state level. And I think Governor Abbott is doing that. Governor Abbott is taking many strides on border protection, on taking terrorism seriously, and how we can not wait on the federal government to implement our own standards of protection. And I think you're going to see more and more of that in Texas. And I think you're going to see that in other states too. They're going to follow suit because the federal government oftentimes can't get out of its own way.
To help us keep the lights on, let's thank our sponsor.
For over 20 years, R Squared Global has served the energy and infrastructure industries. With offices in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, R Squared Global offers engineering, survey, right-of-way, and GIS solutions. For more information, please visit www.gor2.com.
Okay, so I want to turn now to the states, the nations, and just kind of throw out a few, and you kind of tell me, okay, yeah, these are the nation states that I'm concerned with, or maybe these aren't. So, in the news, we obviously have, with President Trump coming in office, there's always talk about Russia and what kind of threat they would be. When you think of technology, you think like China. Obviously, North Korea is doing whatever they're going to do over there. And then you have Syria, which is in the news. Those are kind of the big names that we hear. Over the last decade, if you roll it back, you have Iran, obviously, that's kind of rolled up in that. Iraq and Afghanistan are kind of now a little bit defunct from where they were. So of those nations, are those the kind of nations that we should think about when we're thinking about these threats? Or is it something that I didn't mention?
Well, I think all those are nations of concern, countries of concern for a different reason. So when we talk about the threat from countries and which one poses a greater or lesser threat, we generally look on a spectrum in the national security world. And to simplify it, essentially it's just intent versus capability. And so on that spectrum, you just decide China has both the capability to attack us if they wanted. Do they have the intent and the interest to do so? Not really. Now, they will steal us blind, intellectual properties and economic espionage, but they don't necessarily right now have the interest to attack us because there's so much business and economics that are intertwined. North Korea, however, they have an interest in attacking us, and they probably have the intent. They don't necessarily have the capability right now, or they risk complete annihilation. So when you look at all these countries, you try to measure all those things. In that spectrum, my concern is North Korea and Iran. Iran has an interest, and they have, at least the leadership, has a apocalyptic view of the world that's really frightening when they really get down to it. And when you have an apocalyptic view of things, you tend to act irrational, at least from those of us that feel like we're more rational in how we see the world. They don't feel like they have much to lose. North Korea sees it more as a political thing, but they also don't feel like they have much to lose. So those are the two countries that concern me most. And one country that you didn't bring up that I would throw out, and a concept tied to it, is Venezuela. And Venezuela is, as we've seen, they're going down the tube quickly. The problem is they're best friends with Iran and Russia. that concerns me greatly, because in a world of connectivity that we have today, I'm more concerned with alliances like we saw in World War II versus individual nations operating alone. Nations don't tend to operate alone these days because they're so dependent on one another. They generally have to get buy-in from others because whatever they do will affect someone else. Venezuela is that group that I could see acting on something in concert with Iran and potentially Russia.
Okay, so let's take it like that then. Let's say it doesn't really matter which nation, as you described it. Could be any of those, but they have to have, you said, the capability, the intent, the interest. They have to have kind of these things that drive them to do it. Let's just walk through a couple scenarios for the listeners. What is a potential realistic type threat that they could launch? What kind of damage could that be? And what would be like the worst case attack that they could launch? And what would be the damage there? Kind of give us a scale on that side of things.
Sure, and I'll preface all this with this is purely speculative, so there's no I don't have a money back guarantee on anything I'm saying here. But I think, in my opinion, the most likely, while it may be less consequential in some ways, I think the most likely would be something of a cyber retaliation. When it comes to something like Iran and Venezuela, Iran, I've noticed over time, they really tend to focus on retaliation. They tend to justify their actions after something has been done to them, or they perceive something has been done to them. And that concerns me because the United States will want to take action somewhere against Iran in the future, because Iran's always up to something. They don't ever admit whether they were the first ones to do something. They always act like they were retaliating. I can see them retaliating if the U.S. decides to do something in Venezuela, not necessarily military intervention, but just something as simple as, helping out Colombia or somebody else to control the diplomatic fallout, the political fallout. So I could see them retaliating in some group effort against us with a cyber attack. That would be more the low to medium scale. Now, that cyber attack could be something pretty intensive, but I imagine it would be something more along the lines of relatively small scale to show us that they can do it. A much larger issue, I think these days, would be something like an EMP, a nuclear EMP. So this would be Russia, China, someone, or even North Korea, launching a nuclear missile off the back of a ship, let's say, in the Gulf of Mexico, detonating that missile over the United States and sending an electromagnetic pulse, which would fry any and all electric equipment within the blast radius. Now, it would vary depending on how far you are from the blast radius. That, to me, would be the most consequential, because you're talking about physical damage to electric grids, to phones, to batteries, anything that runs on electronics. Chaos would ensue pretty quickly. Now, that's a highly unlikely scenario, but it still is a possible scenario, and probably short of a nuclear detonation, it's probably the worst case scenario, because it would actually cover more land. It would probably do more damage and keep the United States off the battlefield for a longer period of time. Okay,
so let me ask you like this, because use a sports analogy, if you will. If you're a boxer and you're going to the pro ranks, you start off, you're kind of considered a scrub, and you start fighting other scrubs, and when you beat those scrubs up, you kind of go up and you keep fighting, and eventually, if you're good enough, you fight the champ. Would we see something like that, to where these nations who maybe can't fight the U.S. militarily go out and attack smaller nations to kind of test how good their systems are before they came to the U.S. for an attack? Or can they, or unlike boxing, actually, can they test it and know that it will work and then launch it on a superior military target?
Yeah, I think all those are reasonable. I personally believe that future conflict is headed for something like that, kind of like similar to what we saw in the Cold War, where you had a lot of proxy wars around the world that were fueled by the United States and the Soviet Union. You might see more of that, because we're at a point with both cyber technology and military technology that we can obliterate each other at a blink of an eye. Nobody wants that. Even the most hardened, well, say nobody. I'm sure there's people in Iran that wouldn't mind seeing something like that. But For the most part, most nations don't want that. So what ends up happening is we channel our aggression and our desire to fix and to confront things through smaller countries or through other areas. So yeah, you might see that. Whether they test it and then use it on the United States, that's also a viable option. It's just hard to tell at this point.
Okay, so let's turn to some solutions then for folks in Texas or anywhere that are listening to this and going, oh my goodness, there's real threats to the grid here. What should we do? What are some of the things? I think one of the takeaways I can take immediately is if you know someone, a local official, is to say, hey, go read these reports and let's start the dialogue. But what are some other things people could do that they are listening to kind of prevent themselves from being exposed to these attacks?
This is where I always want to get when we talk about this is I don't want to be the guy that just offers dramatic information that's only suited for Hollywood. I really want to offer in solutions too. And you touched on the first one. It really is, especially if you're in Texas, contacting your local official. There are bills right now being considered that would require hardening of the Texas grid. And what we mean by that is hardening against an EMP. I'm an advocate of hardening the grid against all scenarios. So what I'm advocating for is put technology on the grid that would protect it against these surges. Because what an electromagnetic pulse does sends a surge that components on the grid can't handle. There's technology that would prevent that surge from circulating throughout the grid. One company called Acetor has a great product that can do that. And it's a cost-effective process. So I think there's solutions out there for what local officials can do. So at first, let's contact them, educate them. Second, as an individual, we got to get out of the mindset that the government will be there in 3 to 5 days. They won't. In the most awful situation, you're looking at anywhere between a month and 6 months, and that's the dire situation. So I would encourage your listeners to have stuff, have food, have water, have things stockpiled, both what you can run with and what you can live on in your space for a long period of time. You need to have more than 72 hours. It's wise these days to have backup plans. And I'm not really advocating for building a bunker. If you have the money for it, go ahead. But you really just need to prepared. I would recommend at least a month's worth of food and water, and you can go online. The government has a nice breakdown of how much water you should have per person per day and all those things. But those are two major things that I would recommend preparing yourself.
Okay, and one final question. This may get a little bit outside of your expertise, and if so, we can just kind of go ahead. But we've discussed on this show, kind of directly and indirectly with various guests, is this thought process is that as we look into the emerging markets around the world, it's going to be interesting to see how large utility companies play a role in the long term, because you have all these microgrids and various solutions that are coming in to maybe rural Africa or wherever that are filling the gaps to where a large utility company just can't make money there. And then as those areas grow, obviously, will they go onto the grid? Will they go onto the grid? That's a discussion that we've had. And so I'm curious here. Now, the EMP strike, that's one thing, but just from a cyber attack, what are your thoughts on folks in the States right now in Texas that may say, you know what, maybe now's the time just to kind of look to get off the grid in general, as far as maybe putting solar panels on their house or doing stuff like that where they can self-generate power?
That's an option too. Right now, as I understand it, and I'm not intimately familiar with how those processes work with the solar and all that, but I understand that it's hard to, really, as it remains, the electric grid is still the way to go. You're only going to last so long on a microgrid. You're only going to last so long with solar panels. That technology will continue to improve as people, have more interest in it. But I think that's an option too. With the connectivity that we have, I think people will realize really quickly, if you start to cut cords with the grid, you're going to realize how dependent you are on it and how dependent you are on electricity. It's a major undertaking to exfiltrate yourself from where we're at now. For one, it's just we depend on it. For another thing, so much of what we own and what we do, we rely on other people who are tied in. So it's quite the undertaking. It's worth exploring, maybe on just proportional levels where you say we're not going to completely remove ourselves, but we're going to have it to where we're sustainable for a certain amount of time. That's probably wise.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure where I'll fall in that discussion. When you look at solar technology, it seems to be getting progressively cheaper and cheaper over time, and it's kind of making a nice niche in the market space. But it does seem that these attacks that we're talking about don't happen. Maybe 10, 15 years from now, there might be some solutions in place to where the grid is a little bit more decentralized. And again, it wouldn't, maybe protect itself from these EMP strikes, but some of this hacking, if it's a little bit more isolated, might be a way to look at that. But I don't think we're there today, as you mentioned. It's just something to consider as well. Okay, well, look, thank you so much for your time. This is an interesting discussion, and we will link to both of your articles. I have 2 articles here in the show notes. Is there anything else that you'd like to plug or promote before we let you get out of here today?
Yeah, you can visit our organization, the National Center for Policy Analysis, at ncpa.org. We're a nonprofit think tank, so we live off the investors that invest in us. So we encourage you to take a look at our organization, and if you're interested in what we do, we'd love to talk with you further about it. You can also follow me on Facebook, Senior Fellow David Grantham, and I'm also on Twitter, David_Grantham, the number 1.
Okay, great. We will link to all of that in the show notes, which you can find at globalenergymedia.com. And, this is our second person from the National Center of Policy Analysis we had on Jackie for our Trump 100-Day Roundtable discussion. And, I got to give a shout out to Luke. He's such a big help for you guys over there. I love visiting with him, and he's kind of the guy who kind of made today happen. So probably works behind the scenes and doesn't get enough props, but I want to give him some props while we had a second today.
Well, he's a hard worker. He's a good man.
He is. Well, Dr. Grantham, thank you so much for coming on, and we look to have you on again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Really fascinating stuff there. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed the discussion. I enjoyed looking at these papers and kind of just thinking about all this stuff. It's our second time to discuss cybersecurity threats as it pertains to energy on the show, and I'm sure we'll do more of that in the future. It is a really big topic and a growing industry inside of the energy industry. It's really booming now, and you're starting to see more and more discussion about this. And so it's kind of hard to figure out for someone like myself is how much of this is hype and how much of this is real threats. And so we need to have these discussions to kind of flesh it out. So hope you enjoyed it. And again, you can check out Dr. Grantham and the National Center for Policy Analysis. You will find all of their information in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com. The Global Energy Leaders podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders podcast, powered by R Squared Global.